Hello everyone, I'm William Porter, author of Alcohol Explained, and Laura very kindly invited me to do the seminar tonight. So what I thought I'd do is talk a bit about alcohol withdrawal. So what I'll be talking about is the physiological side of alcohol and how it affects us. There's obviously a lot of psychological to it as well. It's too big a subject to delve into everything. So I thought just for tonight I'll deal with a bit of the physiological side of it. To start at a very simple level, the human brain has its own store of hormones and drugs that it uses itself, and those sort of ones that you would have heard of, for example, are adrenaline. It has these stores of drugs and it releases them at different times and in exactly the right quantities to create quite a nice balance. And that's known as homeostasis. And what that basically means is that's basically the brain working as it should do, so it's all nicely balanced. People with mental health problems that are chemicals, caused by chemical imbalances, are usually because they have too much or too little of a certain brain chemical. And that can lead them to feeling either hyper or depressed. So that's a very high level how the brain works. There's a lot we don't know about the brain. It's phenomenally complicated, and people, even experts on it, don't know huge amounts. But that's essentially how it works. Now, alcohol is a chemical depressant. Alcohol is a chemical depressant. And when I use the term depressant, I'm using it in its chemical sense, which means it's something that inhibits or reduces nerve activity. So when you take a drink, say you're, a typical day, you come in from work, you put the kids to bed, you're feeling stressed, you've got your adrenaline going, you have a drink, you immediately feel more relaxed because it's a depressant. So it's depressing those feelings of anxiety. The problem is with it is the brain reacts to it. The brain doesn't just sit there and allow you to put different chemicals in and do anything. It tries to balance it out because the brain is working along with the right level of hormones and stimulants, and then you introduce a depressant. So what the brain does to try and counter it, it releases its own store of stimulants, which is fine. That starts to then level out. But the problem is then when you go to bed, fall asleep, the depressant, the alcohol, is then processed and is removed, and then it leaves the stimulant. So there's a period after drinking where you feel it's almost a corresponding, if alcohol makes you feel relaxed, there's a corresponding period of anxiety where the alcohol, the depressant effect of the alcohol is left, and the stimulant effect of the brain's own stimulants that it's released to counter it are left. And that leaves you feeling anxious, out of sorts, whatever. And that's what I'm referring to when I refer to alcohol withdrawal. So just to summarise, there are two main types of drug. There's a stimulant, which makes you feel more alert, and there's a depressant, which brings you down. The brain has its own thing, its own amounts, and it keeps them nicely balanced. So you introduce a depressant, the brain counters it with the stimulant, the depressant wears off, and you've got that period of being overstimulated. Let's look at how that links to tolerance, because this is a lot of people don't even think about this, but we take it for granted that over years and years of drinking we can drink more and more. And when you first start drinking, you may have one glass of wine or 2 or 3 beers, and then 10-15 years down the line you'll quite happily sit there and put 2 bottles of wine away in an evening. I don't even need to ask, but imagine what would happen if you sat down having never taken an alcoholic drink before in your life and drank 2 bottles of wine. You'd be sick, but if you could somehow keep it down, it'd probably kill you. So there is a difference. The difference is that your brain becomes more proficient and creates more of these stimulants to counter the alcohol. Now, in the normal scheme of things, without introducing drugs, your brain has exactly the right amount of these stimulants that it needs. It doesn't need huge amounts of them. Alcohol is in fact a very powerful depressant, so when you start drinking, your brain just doesn't have enough stimulant to counter it. So the first time you drink, you can only have 1 or 2, and then that's about your limit. But as the brain uses up stimulants more and more, it creates more and more of them, and that's the difference. That's how you can drink more 10 years down the line than you could when you first started. When you look at dictionary definitions of alcoholism or alcohol dependency, one of the definitions is the physiological changes in the brain caused by long-term heavy drinking, and people sort of sit there and think, oh, what a terrible thing that someone's drunk so much for so long, their brain changes. Anyone who can drink more now than they could when they started has that brain change. It's just not as extreme as the long-term extreme problem drinker or someone with alcohol dependency. It's a matter of degrees, and we sort of accept this, the Hollywood or the extreme version where we think of like leaving Las Vegas or the Lost Weekend, where you see the alcoholics sat there and they're twitching and hallucinating and in a really bad way, and they can't do the simplest thing like sign a check or get out of their chair without having a huge drink inside of them. And we kind of take it for granted that it's either all or nothing. You go through your drinking life absolutely fine, and then suddenly you have this huge withdrawal. But of course it's not that. Things in nature don't work that way. It's gradual. The process is gradual, and it gets progressively worse. The more you drink, the more stimulant your brain releases into you, and the more out of sync you feel when the alcohol wears off. This is how alcohol affects sleep disruption. If you think about it, and again going back to the basics, where there's two types of drugs, there's the stimulants that wake you up, and there's the depressants that make you fall asleep, make you feel calm and relaxed and knock you out. Alcohol is a depressant, so what you would assume is if you drink a lot, you sleep for hours and hours and hours. Now that's exactly what does happen to people who start drinking. When you first start drinking, you sleep for hours and hours and hours. Your brain can't counter the alcohol and it acts as a depressant. But as your brain becomes more and more adept at producing stimulants to counter the depressing effect, that's when you see the stimulating effect that comes about afterwards. And that's one very simple way of measuring the extremities, if you like, of the alcohol withdrawal. It's almost like a process. When you first start drinking, you have one or two drinks and you sleep for hours and hours and hours. Then what usually starts happening is you start to find you're waking up earlier and earlier. And you often, in early stages, you actually feel quite good. You're waking up feeling quite bright and breezy. That's the stimulants there, and the depressant's gone. But of course, as it becomes more and more extreme, you're waking up earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier. And eventually you're waking up in the middle of the night unable to sleep. And that's what a lot of people do find if they've been drinking for a few years, is the really bad insomnia that they get, waking up in the middle of the night and unable to get back to sleep. And they're not waking up in the middle of the night unable to sleep, lying there feeling nicely relaxed. What it usually is you wake up in the middle of the night and you start worrying about things. You start worrying about this or that, anything you can. And the reason for that is too much stimulants inside you. They do two things. They stop you sleeping and they leave you feeling extremely anxious. So that's one way of measuring how extreme your withdrawal is. It's whether it's kicking in not at all and you just feel sleepy all the time, or it's kicking in first thing in the morning, or it's kicking in the middle of the night. The other thing is, as the alcohol gets worse and as the withdrawal gets worse and worse, it leaves you feeling worse and worse. So early stage drinkers, they may wake up and they may feel slightly anxious, but it's nothing too bad and they'll just get on with things. But as it becomes increasingly bad, you feel like increasingly unable to get on with things and do things during the day. Just simple things that you might take for granted, like a bill comes in that's irritating, or something breaks down and you've got to ring up and get it fixed or something. Lots of time when you're hungover, you just can't face it. And the reason you cannot face it is that chemical imbalance has just left you unable to deal with things, so you can't do it. Another way you can measure the withdrawal is by taking your heart rate. Lots of people now have Fitbits and things that measure your heart rate. Depressants usually will slow down your heart rate. Stimulants will put your heart rate up. Now what you will normally find is if you wear a Fitbit, when you're drinking, your heart rate will remain fairly constant, may go up a bit, may go down a bit, but you'll see it peak after a few hours, usually about 4 or 5 hours. You'll see as you fall asleep and the alcohol, you stop drinking, the alcohol starts to get processed, and then the stimulants start to, put it this way, your brain's normal, drink some depressant, the brain creates stimulants to counter it, and then slowly over the night, the depressant effect of the alcohol goes down and the stimulants are there. So that's how you see your heart rate go up. So the other thing that these Fitbits do is they measure your sleep, and you'll see how disruptive your sleep is even after just 1 or 2 drinks. The other point is, of course, it makes you very emotionally unstable. I don't know if anyone's got any questions. I can see sort of things coming up. If anyone does have any questions, do tap them in, because it's a bit more interesting for me rather than just a monologue to actually answer questions that come in. So do feel free to tap in any questions while things are going along. But yeah, so it leaves you quite emotionally unstable. Another thing that alcohol does, the front part of your brain is called the limbic system. And one of the things it does, it regulates emotion. Now, how emotion works, it's quite interesting. It's not as you would expect it, that emotion, say anger, just kicks in and then runs and then peters off. How it works is it's triggered and then it's regulated by the brain, and the part of the brain, as I say, that regulates it is the limbic system. So just to give a simple example, if you do something that annoys you, like you drop something and break it and it irritates you, anger will be triggered, but the limbic system will regulate it and calm you down. Now what alcohol does, it depresses the effect of the limbic system, so it stops it working properly, so that when you've been drinking, emotions aren't regulated. So something will happen to trigger an emotion and it just flies off and your brain cannot regulate it. And that's why there's this huge tendency, this link between alcohol and, for example, anger and violence. Because when you're drinking, something very minor might annoy you and your brain cannot counter it, your brain cannot regulate it, so the anger just flies. It's not just anger, and that's why we have those very stereotypical views of, people drinking and they can't stop crying, or they become over emotional, or they become very sentimental and start contacting their exes. That's purely from that. There's a question. How long does it take for your brain to get back to normal after you have given up drink? Right, so how it normally works is, and again, it's impossible to say for definite, because as I mentioned, it depends how far down the line you are. So if you're drinking a bottle of wine a night, the stimulants to counter that are obviously going to be very different to if you're a 3 bottles of spirit a day drinker. The worst case alcohol situation you can possibly be in, it's usually 5 days. So your brain will be back to normal within 5 days. Now, how it will work is, most people level out at about 5 hours. So what you will find is, if you are drinking and you finish your last drink at 11 o'clock at night, that will probably take a few minutes to be absorbed into your bloodstream, but you're probably looking at about 5 hours after that where the stimulants start to outbalance the depressants. So if you finish your last drink at 11, you can look forward to waking up at 4 in the morning feeling anxious and miserable. The stimulants, now the alcohol is actually processed fairly quickly. It's turned into another substance that's the thing that actually makes you feel sick, and that takes longer to come out of your system. But what we're actually, and what I think read the question is the actual problem is when your brain starts to return to normal. Now, what you will normally find is, even in the absolute worst case scenario, the stimulants are left over and they will be there for the following day and maybe even the day after that, and in an absolute worst case the day after that as well. But the other thing you need to bear in mind is you won't go back to feeling normal. So if the actual question is when do you go back to feeling as if you've never drunk, what you need to factor in is the sleep deprivation as well. If you are a regular drinker, you are constantly disrupting your sleep. Now, sleep is like a habit. You need to stop for a few days. It's usually about 4 or 5 days before you get into a normal sleep routine. but then it takes a few days or even weeks to get back into that normal sleeping habit. So if you're asking about how long it actually takes you to get back to feeling normal, it can take a few weeks because it's getting back into catching up on sleep. There's a couple of questions here actually saying, one person 8 weeks alcohol free and still exhausted, exercise loads and eat really well, is this normal? Someone else 7 weeks and still don't feel fresh. The question I would ask is how well are you sleeping? That's the main thing. The exercise thing is, because that's my usual answer to that. If people say they've stopped drinking and they don't sleep well, exercise is the key thing. There's some other things that can disrupt sleep. One of them, of course, is caffeine. So you might find if you're drinking coffee or tea later in the day, that can be affecting sleep. I don't know enough about the two people who've asked the questions, but that might be something to consider. If you smoke, that is a stimulant as well. So if you're smoking and drinking lots of tea and coffee, that can disrupt your sleep and not get it back to normal. But usually what you find is if you're eating well and exercising fairly well, you should be back to normal. I'm not sure if there's any other questions anyone's got. But so yeah, hopefully that's helpful. And as I say, I can't think of anything more to say on sleep is the main thing. Usually what it is, after about 5 or 6 days, you should be going back to sleeping normally. If you're not, the things I would suggest doing is firstly exercise, and if you can exercise earlier in the day, it's better. And what you'd normally be looking to try and do is some cardio, so getting your heart rate up for about 20 minutes or so, and try and avoid caffeinated drinks after about midday. So that might actually change things and help them a bit. The thing to bear in mind, I think, on I don't know if anyone else has got any other questions. Otherwise, something else that might be quite worth mentioning is blackouts, which is a question quite a lot of people often have, and that again, it relates to the limbic system. And that's to do with memory and how memories are transferred. Now again, there's a lot of people don't understand about memories and how it works. But what we do know with alcohol, and the main overriding theory is, and it is only a theory, is that it interrupts your short-term memory. And short-term memories don't get transferred to long-term memory. So quite often what you can have, and the thing that affects the limbic system most is not huge amounts of drinking one time, but long-term regular drinking. So what you quite often find is people that are drinking long-term, they may not be completely intoxicated, but the constant drinking can be enough to interrupt the memories being transferred from short to long-term. So you could have quite large periods where you simply don't remember what's happening. And of course the other problem with blackouts is, so you've got this period where you're drinking, you don't remember what you're doing, but if you factor into that it also, because your limbic system's been affected, that your emotions can't be properly regulated. So you might find, for example, you're in a situation where you're drinking, you're not going to remember what you're doing even though you're not completely intoxicated, but the level of intoxication is enough to completely disturb your emotions. So you may find something absolutely hilarious, or you may become upset and angry about something, so you have to act on it. And then you wake up in the next day, there's 2 points to consider. Firstly, you don't remember it. But secondly, because you are then suffering the alcohol withdrawal, and you're extremely overwrought and anxious, you're looking back on that, not really understanding why you did it. It's almost like a Jekyll and Hyde thing. When you did it, you were feeling very angry or upset, but on the other hand, when you come out of it the other side, you're feeling anxious and afraid. So you really can't tally up what you've done. But the key thing here is you don't have to be completely intoxicated to be doing these things. You just need to have enough alcohol in your system over time to disrupt how the memories are transferred. What do you know about the recent link to alcohol and Alzheimer's? Honestly, not a huge amount, to be honest. It's not something I've read a massive amount into. But what I would say is alcohol, one of the things alcohol does is it stops you from absorbing vitamin B12. Vitamin B12, if you have a complete lack of it over a long period of time, it actually causes you brain damage, and that's where wet brain comes from. So knowing that alcohol can affect you in that way, I would be not surprised at all to know that it probably causes, well, it certainly causes increased senility and brain damage. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if it affected alcohol, if it affected and increased Alzheimer's. So sorry, I'm just looking at the other questions. Yeah, someone's just saying about drinking and get overly emotional. That is completely normal. In fact, it would be very peculiar if you were to have a human being that could drink, you know, reasonable amounts of alcohol and not get overly emotional. I think a lot of people do say, because what I've tried to do with Alcohol Explained is try and summarise the universal effects of alcohol on every human being, not only the sort of the physiological side, but also the psychological side. And people quite often say, you can't talk to me about this, you don't know why I drink. But the fact of the matter is, you may have individual problems, and I don't know your problems, and that's fine. I have no interest in knowing your individual problems. But what I do know is why people reach for a drink to relieve those problems, why they reach for alcohol to relieve those problems, and not, for example, tea or coffee or orange juice or water. It's simply because alcohol is a chemical depressant. So when you drink it, it depresses your feelings. So if you're angry or upset or miserable, it will take the edge off those things. But I think something to bear in mind that's quite important, as the effect on the limbic system takes effect, that emotion runs away anyway. So you're worse off even during the drinking session, to say nothing of the problems you have the next morning when you're hungover and actually tired. So to go into that in a bit more detail, let's say you have an argument with your partner and you're upset and angry. So you take an alcoholic drink and it takes the edge off it slightly, but then of course that wears off. So you need another alcoholic drink and that takes the edge off it, but then that wears off. So, you know, you've got anger and upset and the alcoholic drink takes the edge off it, but then the drink wears off after a few minutes and you need another one and another one and another one. But the problem is, as it affects the limbic system, your emotions start to get unregulated, so they just fly. So the problem you have is, you may start drinking because you're angry and upset, but after 7 or 8 drinks, you're even angrier and more upset. So it makes you absolutely worse. Someone here has just asked, can alcohol cause joint pain? One of the things alcohol does, and this is going back to alcohol and sleep, there's 2 types of sleep. There's deep sleep and REM sleep. Deep sleep is the very deep sleep where your body repairs itself, and the REM sleep is sort of lighter sleep, and it's where you dream. Nobody really knows what REM sleep is and how it helps you. We know that deep sleep is where your body repairs itself. Don't really know what REM sleep does, but they've done tests with rats where they've stopped them having REM sleep and they're dead within a few weeks. So it's absolutely crucial, and in a normal sleeping pattern, you go through 6 or 7 periods of REM sleep, and that's mixed with deep sleep. So these work out and you're fine. Now the problem is, as you're going back to the depressant stimulant thing, the first few hours you go into deep sleep, which is fine. Deep sleep's good, but not in this particular case because it's not mixed with any REM sleep. And then of course when the stimulants start to counterbalance it, you can't go back into deep sleep. So alcohol probably can cause joint pain because the simple fact is you're not getting the quality sleep you need, which is where your body repairs itself. So yeah, someone's just said alcohol is a depressant, so isn't it ironic that some of us reach for it when we're feeling anxious or depressed? And I think that's a good point, but the fact of the matter is it does take the edge off it in the short term. So if you're anxious or depressed, the alcohol will take the edge off that. But as it affects the limbic system, it starts to get worse and worse. So that's why, and it's a bit of it's often the thing with alcohol, if you think about it, there's a lot of anomalies with it that don't make a lot of sense. And again, what I've tried to do with Alcohol Explained is just think about them and try and make sense of them. Because we all reach for a drink when we're angry, but we also know that people when they're drunk become ridiculously angry and aggressive. the two things don't really tally together, but that's it. We know on an instinctive level that alcohol will take the edge off anger, because it does in the short term. For that one drink, for 10 minutes or so afterwards, you feel less angry because it's a depressant. But as I say, after the 6th or 7th drink, because of the effect on the limbic system, the thing just flies off and you become absolutely worse than you were to begin with. I'm not sure if anyone else has got any other questions, or whether I should start drawing things to a close. I think I've covered pretty much everything I was going to say. Maybe just the last thing I would add to it then is, as we've sort of mentioned the depression, there's a few points here I think probably worth touching on how alcohol causes depression. One of them is obviously the short-term thing, because if you think about it, it's very simplest. The brain is working at a fairly simple level, and everything's balanced, and that's where you feel good. You feel fine, you feel happy. Things may not be going as you'd want them to, but you feel able to deal with whatever you need to deal with. You introduce alcohol, which is a depressant, and it makes you feel slightly more relaxed in the short term. But then as the stimulants start to counter it, you feel overly anxious. And what the feeling is, it's a feeling of being out of sorts and not feeling right. And this is actually the main benefit of alcohol at that point, because obviously if the next day you're feeling out of sorts because the stimulant's too high, you drink alcohol, which is depressant, it brings stimulants down and it leaves you feeling back to normal. So then you feel a lot more happy. But of course, as things go up and up and up, the basically disarray in the chemicals in the brain gets worse and worse. If you couple that as well to the lack of sleep, you just become increasingly incapable of dealing with things, which is obviously a major cause of depression. So I think that's pretty much it. I'm not sure if there's any other questions. Someone said, do you agree with the recommended alcohol? I'm not sure if that means the recommended alcohol daily guidelines. I mean, for me, no. I think the other thing probably worth bearing in mind, and this is just personal to me, but I don't moderate. I've just quit alcohol, and one of the main reasons for that is and this is my view, this is how I see things fitting together. You may kind of listen to all this and say, okay, yeah, the depressant, stimulant, so I accept all that. But why get drunk? Because you have a drink, the depressed effect relaxes you, and as the stimulants start to outbalance you, have another one, which is fine. You may be constantly drinking, but you don't have to get utterly intoxicated. But this is one of the light bulb moments for me, was realising that actually that relaxation, anxious feeling was outpaced by the intoxication side of it. So to give a sort of a simple math, if you like the effect that 2 drinks has on you, you get to 6 o'clock in the evening, you have 2 drinks, so you feel 2 drinks relaxed, and you're also 2 drinks intoxicated. And this is where I think it's useful to think of it. We've always taken alcohol as one effect, and that effect is it relaxes you and it leaves you slightly intoxicated. So it gives you mental relaxation, it leaves you feeling calm, and it leaves you feeling slightly intoxicated. And obviously the intoxication is the lack of coordination and the slurring your words and all the rest of it. And we see it as one process, but it isn't one process. The mental relaxation and the intoxication it runs its course at completely different times. So let's go back to the example. If you like the effect of 2 drinks making you feel 2 drinks mentally relaxed, so if 6 o'clock in the evening comes, you have your 2 drinks, so your 2 drinks relaxed and your 2 drinks intoxicated. Those 2 drinks of relaxation will wear off very quickly, sort of 5 or 10 minutes usually, but the intoxication will last for an hour or so. So the mental relaxation wears off. So if you like the effect of 2 drinks, you have your 2 drinks at 6 o'clock. By 6:15, it's worn off, so you need another 2 drinks. So you have your 2 drinks at 6:15. You're still 2 drinks relaxed, but you're now 4 drinks intoxicated. Now by 30:30, it's worn off again, so you need another 2 drinks. So you're still just 2 drinks relaxed, but now you're 6 drinks intoxicated. The timings are off, and it will vary for individuals, because part of the thing that will affect it is how good your brain is at countering the stimulants, and that's different for everyone. And the longer you've been drinking for, and the more stimulants your brain creates, the quicker it happens. But basically, as time goes by, you have to drink quicker and quicker and quicker to chase the feeling of relaxation, but to become increasingly intoxicated. So for me, I don't moderate, because what will happen, I will have 2 drinks, it will wear off, leaving a feeling of anxiety, so I want more drinks to relieve that feeling of anxiety, and as I drink those more drinks, I'll become increasingly intoxicated, and that's basically what happened to me and what happened to a lot of people. Trying to moderate doesn't work, purely because you're constantly chasing a feeling of relaxation that leaves you getting increasingly intoxicated. So I think that's probably pretty much sums it up, and again, that's where I am. And again, it's a personal thing, but for me, that's why personally moderating doesn't work for me, because let's take a classic example. Now I'm sat here now, and let's say, I don't know, something happens that leaves me stressed and anxious, so I reach for an alcoholic drink. In the immediate short term, that will leave me feeling less anxious, so that's fine, I've had natural benefit from that. But within a few minutes, that will wear off. But it won't wear off leaving me where I was before, because my brain will have introduced stimulants to try and counteract the alcohol. So I won't just go back to feeling normal, I'll go back to a corresponding feeling of anxiety. So I've started off anxious, I've counteracted with a drink, but as the drink's worn off and the anxious feeling of the stimulants have worn off, I'm worse than I was before. So I've gained something for 10 minutes, but then I've paid back over the next half an hour or an hour, and the only way I can relieve that is to keep drinking. So if I've made a decision that, I don't know, I'm 10 points stressed and a drink will relieve that, I'm going to have to drink throughout the entire evening and end up completely intoxicated just to keep relieving that feeling of anxiety. And then, of course, on top of that, so even in the short term, even for that, it's not worth it. But then if you then factor in, well, actually, I'm not going to sleep properly, so I'll be waking up tired and exhausted tomorrow. I'll probably be waking up at 4 in the morning and sitting there for 2 or 3 hours worrying before my alarm goes off, so I'll be going into work exhausted and feeling dreadful, and I'll actually be hungover. For me, it's just not worth it. And I think Annie Grace summed it up really well, in that for her as well, trying to moderate is just constantly making decisions about when you can drink and when you can't drink, and trying to time it. And for me, it's easier just not to bother. You just put it to one side and it's done. You don't have to worry about, I've had one drink, I need another one here, or not have another one. Personally, I find it much easier not to. So, as I say, I think that probably sums up everything I have to say. If there's no other questions, I'll probably wrap up. I hope that was fairly interesting for everyone. If you want more information, obviously, and I do emphasise, because someone once said to me, oh, there must be more to it than this. There is. I mean, I've probably covered off 6 or 7 high-level 6 or 7 chapters in Alcohol Explained, which is now 36 chapters. So as you can say, obviously, I've covered off a fairly small part of it. There's a lot more on the website, and the first 5 chapters are on the website as well, which is alcoholexplained.com. And I can also be contacted through the website as well, so if you've got any further questions, do drop me a line. There's a contact page on the website. So I hope you found that interesting, and I hope it was fairly coherent, and thanks all for listening.